Okay. So basically, we spent last week talking about the evidence and kind of orienting your trainees to late life depression. So now this is the part of the training where you start to get into the nuts and bolts. So today we're going to cover just the kind of process of pearls overall. We're going to dive deeper into the pearls components, particularly focused on how you teach problem solving, treatment, and behavioral activation. And we'll touch on the worksheet as well as a tool that we use. So our learning objectives for today are to describe how participants proceed through the program, describe the Pearls program components, including behavioral activation, problem solving, treatment, and the clinical case review, understand how to use some of the tools, the worksheet and the tracking chart, and then understand how you facilitate the different role plays during the training. So in terms of the adult learning principles to think about today, this is really why do we not just basically talk at people during Pearls trainings, but why do we use role plays and small group discussions? So there's a couple of reasons that we do this. It's a way to practice new skills that are being learned and apply them. It can really help people experience things that may be uncomfortable or familiar and to do it in a safe space like a training environment instead of doing it out with their clients for the first time. It's a really nice way to get feedback and provide feedback to each other from your peers, and it's a way to practice. We also know from previous training and other projects that it helps really increase retention in not just the training itself, but also the program going forward. So it's really important to use different ways to reach learners because we all learn differently, and it also just helps mix it up and keep it engaging. So I realize I have not been doing anything physical to get up and stretch during this Zoom because these are much shorter than our trainings usually are, which are all day. But please, I give you permission to get up and stretch and walk around. And if you need to turn off your camera, but we try to have written materials, we try to speak, we try to show different visuals and graphics, and then we actually practice, right? We do problem solving together. So the other thing we do is we teach together. So these are the two things that I think are fun to practice together because this is a chance to both cover the content as well as get feedback from each other and make it your own. So I'll have one of you today volunteer at the end to describe what is the rationale of doing problem solving, treatment, and behavior activation. And then I'll have the other one teach step 5 and 6 of problem solving. So that's the picking a solution that you're going to do this week and coming up with an action plan and including the confidence scale, because that's an important piece that we used to not really highlight at the trainings, but we have found that people find it really useful. And because people come with different experience with using a confidence scale or motivational interviewing, it's good to make sure that you teach it. So first, we do the process. So kind of before we dive deep into the skills of teaching people problem solving and behavior activation, we want to just, at this point, give people a little bit of an overview. As you might remember in the first webinar, we showed this just to give people the landscape of what the program is. And then we let people know that we weren't going to teach things linearly. But this is the time in the training where we just a little bit more lay it out for folks, what the program's going to look like. And if you are doing the training in person, sometimes actually we have this printed out. And so you can just kind of refer at different points in the training where you are, almost like a map, or you can just refer to it as a visual, as a slide during a distance training. So we start with recruitment, this first box. The reason we mention this now, even though we talk about it during the implementation time of the training, and honestly, we talked about this morning on our TA call, this comes up a lot, is because you'll just start getting questions about this throughout the training. Even though you're trying to focus on teaching the skills, people will just start asking. So I think there's a couple of things you highlight here. One is that it really can be done by your Pearls team, your coach, or your counselor, but it also can be done by others. So this is not something you have to take on if your agency doesn't require it, or if you're a larger agency. We also stress that this doesn't just have to be a homegrown or internal program. This can really be something where you're engaging people from the community. It's really dependent on how your program is set up. Pearls doesn't require any specific way of doing recruitment or where you get referrals from. And then what we stress is that there needs to be some initial screening often. So You can just go right to screening to see if someone's eligible for pearls, but it'll help you if you think about how can I give someone a brief depression screen or some other way to see, oh yeah, this person might be struggling with depression and they might be a good fit for pearls. Otherwise, I guarantee you're going to spend a lot of time screening out people who aren't a great fit for the program. So the next step on that box is screening for eligibility. This is typically done by the Pearls counselor, and I will say you can call yourself whatever you want. You could be a coach, you could be a provider, whatever works for you. But it doesn't have to be. So some agencies have somebody else do the screening. Maybe it's their program manager or somebody who typically does intake. But really the reason you got screening is you have to identify whether the client is eligible to participate. COVID times, it's all been done remotely, but many agencies kind of break it up and they do a phone call and then an in-person visit, which can be really helpful, especially if someone maybe has some hearing challenges, maybe some concerns about trust and safety. Though we were this morning on the TA call talking about how for some people, they don't want you in their home quite yet. So you might have to do the work over the phone initially just to build that trust and rapport. We will talk about screening at a later webinar, but as you know, you'll be teaching folks about both screening for clinically significant depression as well as some exclusionary conditions. And then it's really important in screening to not sort of invalidate the client. And really, it's more that this program's not a good fit for you, and we're going to find you a better resource. So the main part of Pearls are the sessions, right? What it is you do and teach with the client. And what we try to remind people when we're training them is that there is a rationale for the structure of Pearls. Some people really push back on how structured Pearls is, but it's really to help both you as the provider and then the participant as well to learn the skills and make sure you cover what we think are really the key ingredients to helping somebody with their depression. So every session will have a PHQ-9. Every session you'll touch on some of the kind of rationale and principles of the program. Every session you'll go through this worksheet doing a problem solving activity together or steps together. And then every session, ideally, you'll also plan some pleasant social and physical activities. And as we talked about before, if you don't do all every time, it's not the end of the world, but we really are trying to encourage people to try new skills and to do as much as they can, because that's really essential for them to learning how they can maybe feel better in their life with your support and your guidance and your teaching. We remind folks at this point that, the first session is going to look a little different. There's going to be some assessment. You're going to generate a problem list. You're going to actually kind of set the stage and explain the Pearls program a little bit. And then you're also going to be letting other providers know about Pearls treatment. So it's important to tell your trainees that up front, because sometimes that first session feels really long and it's kind of a turn off to the structure. And oh my gosh, there's so much paperwork. So you can just normalize it and let them know, yep, the first session you're going to cover a lot. And if you're doing it by phone, you might need to break it up into 2 sessions because it can be a lot for people over the phone with all the paperwork to get through. Likewise, the last session tends to be a little bit different. So you do it like all others. It's a working session. We will spend some time at the last webinar talking about how to do the final session. But really, it's a chance for you to celebrate and review and acknowledge the client's progress, what was learned, and changes that occurred over the course of the program. We really recommend, too, that you provide extra worksheets and forms so people can try to keep these skills going on their own. And then we have a couple of final forms that are not required, but we encourage you to use so that you get feedback on how the clients did and see if they changed other outcomes over the course of the program. And then lastly, we let to know our trainees know now that the model, while brief, does include some follow-up calls. We don't have a really firm structure for these calls. Really, the intention is it's so that somebody can more gradually transition away from the program and that you can just check in and see how they're doing. So it's really reinforcing the learnings, and it's typically not going through a whole worksheet. And then there's that last part of that box is closing out a participant. And this is going to differ for every agency, but we just like to remind folks that just like other services they provide at their organization, Pearls is one, and there's probably going to need to be some closeout information that needs to happen. The other thing that's helpful to teach people before you get into the skills is what we recommend in terms of session frequency. It's important to highlight with your trainees up front, this is brief program. This is not meant to be an ongoing long-term therapy or support or service. It's also important to try as best as you can to stick with this model. I know it's not easy when you're working with older adults with complex health needs, but it's important to teach people why it is we set pearls up this way. So weekly is meant to really build momentum, to build rapport and just get folks used to like, oh yeah, I'm problem solving, I'm planning activities. Then we try to taper the sessions. And that's really so that the older adult or your participant can really be empowered and say, oh, wait, I'm able to do this without seeing Dina every week. Like this is actually something I am starting to do. But it's not so quick to monthly that if somebody has like a crisis or something that's interfering with them using the skills, you can't support them in figuring out how to do those skills better, or maybe they never picked a problem that was really bothering them until session 4, and so they need your support. And then we go to monthly to really help the older adult as well as us as the counselor see if, wow, those improvements in the PHQ-9, those actually can be maintained when I'm not meeting with them as often. It gets the client used to you not being in the room all the time. And then we do the monthly follow-up calls. Andrea, you had a question?
Yeah, with the schedule on the last slide, is there some amount of acceptable drift from this particular schedule, just given medical appointments, illnesses, things like that, where we're still maintaining fidelity, but we've deviated a little bit from the schedule?
Very much, Andrea. And I think I'll leave it to you how much you want to communicate that during a training versus during technical assistance.
Right.
So you may notice the training is kind of pretty by the book, right? It's like, do this. We really think this is the way to do it. This is how it was done in the original research. But medical appointments, that's honestly the most common reason that this schedule doesn't work out is people get busy and overwhelmed and they've been waiting for 3 months to see their doctor and they get to see their doctor that day that you're scheduled to come. The other common thing, quite frankly, is people not feeling well. So because they're just pain issues, sleep issues, you name it. Got to kind of watch out for either of those. When people start to say, I can't meet and I can't meet, and it happens on a recurring basis, it's actually an opportunity to check in with them in terms of, is there something else going on with you or in their life that's making it hard to engage? But that doesn't have to happen initially. So we don't have a hard and fast rule on your drift question. I would say the main important spirit is weekly to monthly over the span of about 5 months. But whether it's, 4 weekly sessions and then 2 bi-monthly and then 2 monthly, that doesn't matter so much. I do know too that some models have to shift their frequency a bit in terms of billing and reimbursement. So that is something we're happy to bring to coaching calls and kind of think together through if you feel like, ooh, this is vastly different than what they set out to do.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. And I will say who you're training, you may have specifications that you need to just say, you have to do it this way kind of thing, like no ifs, ands, or buts. So I welcome you to set those guardrails if you need to tighter. I think the other thing to remind people, because, evidence-based programs and lots of supports and services can be kind of cumbersome. So just reminding people, your trainees, that like there are some administrative duties to doing this work. Your agency may require more or less of these, but in general, you need to keep track of their PHQ-9. We have a tracking sheet that we recommend, but you can track it elsewhere. That you need to maybe keep notes. Maybe you need to keep case notes. Maybe you need to keep other things about what happened during each session. We'll talk about data management. We always mention to trainees, there's tools like Wellware or PeerPlace to do this, but we do not push these tools. We know that many of you already have tools in place. And then we remind folks about that you're going to need to do supervision as they start to do pearls. And we will talk about that later in the training. So that's it in a nutshell. It's kind of fast, but it's meant to sort of have the trainee think about what's coming up ahead. This is how the whole kind of model works together. And now let's kind of dive into the problem solving and the behavioral activation. So as we talked about the first session and we talked about the stool sitting on the floor, we really see these key components of the model. the behavioral activation, which is the social, physical, and pleasant events, the problem solving treatment, and then that clinical case review or clinical supervision, the foundation which Pearl sits on. So I want to talk next about how you teach people about why it is we do these. Because it's one thing to say, yeah, these are the core components, but part of what you're doing as a trainer is trying to sell people on this. Like there's a reason to spend time with my client to teach behavioral activation. And it's not just because my funder's telling me I have to do it. Like this actually works. There's some theory and evidence behind it. So what's some of the rationale or evidence behind behavioral activation? So we know that depression results in people feeling bad and then doing less. And this can look like a lot of things. Some people just get tired and lethargic. Some people are less physically active. Some people withdraw socially. And we end up getting in this cycle and stuck in this feeling bad, doing less, and then actually feeling bad or worse. So the whole idea about behavioral activation is if you take a behavioral focus to feeling better, not a cognitive focus, it might help you feel better. And the idea is we're going to do something even if we don't feel like it. And this is like the big aha with behavioral activation. Many of us, not even living with depression, but particularly when we're living with depression, are sort of waiting to feel better, or we just don't feel like it. Our motivation's lousy. We don't have great energy. We're not sleeping well. We're feeling like a failure. And so we kind of wait to feel better, or we just stop doing stuff and don't even realize we've stopped. And so what behavioral activation says is instead of trying to like fix how you're thinking and feeling about things, let's just try it. Let's do something outside in approach, and that will help us feel better. So it's that do more, feel better idea. We specifically focus though on certain types of activities, not just doing more of anything. So one is social. We know that connecting with people virtually, in person, even writing someone a letter, not even having a live interaction, helps with depressed mood and energy. We also know that moving the body, being physical, is another proven antidepressant. So it's not just planning any activity, it's planning things that are social and planning things that are physical, because those have been shown to specifically help people boost their mood and energy. Also, planning something pleasant. So this is very similar rationale as for physical and social activities. You know, it is very important that we have things in our lives that bring us joy, but when we're depressed, we just tend to withdraw and we turn inward, and we don't even realize it, that we've sort of stopped doing the things that give our life meaning. So again, it's important that we plan things that are pleasant because that's going to help us feel better. It's really important here that when you're talking about pleasant events, you don't necessarily say that they're happy things, because when someone's depressed, that feels kind of demoralizing and they don't even know where to start. So it's really, what are things in your life that you used to do or that you've always wanted to do, simple things that enhance the quality of their life. These are things that don't have to cost anything. And I'm sure you've all seen, and you can refer your group to, there is this list of 200 plus activities in the toolkit when someone's feeling really stuck. Caution, that list may not be culturally appropriate, may not be something relevant to your client. So I always encourage people to start with their client and then go to the list if they're just looking for new ideas of little joyful things to do. So that's the rationale for behavioral activation. But what is the rationale for problem solving treatment? Why do we spend time and really the bulk of the Pearl sessions on this? And this is where we really get into some of the principles behind Pearl. So we know that our depressive symptoms, our clients' depressive symptoms, are partially caused by everyday problems. It doesn't mean there could be some past trauma, some other things going on, a medical condition, but having everyday problems is part of what contributes to depression. We know that if those problems are resolved or even feel like they're starting to be resolved, that our symptoms will maybe improve. And that there's a way to do this. There's actually these problem-solving techniques that are proven to help somebody resolve or get a sense of control over their problems. So the key characteristics of problem solving is that it's very brief, it's very structured. There is a 7-step process you follow every time. It is very much focused on the here and now. So this is not spending a lot of time in how you were raised, how that impacts your depression. It's really focusing on what is a problem for me today. And it's really collaborative. I mean, obviously we want the client to drive, we want them to pick problems that matter to them, but part of while you're there is because you can help people brainstorm, you can help reflect the problems that maybe they're saying, but not recognizing it's a problem for them. So it's really a collaborative approach. And most of our training is really focused on this. So, people think of the Pearls training as being that visual I just showed you earlier, but I would say the bulk of the time is spent practicing the problem solving skills. I would remind your trainees, though, that Pearls is not just problem solving treatment. It really is the behavioral activation that you're teaching them. It's doing a PHQ-9 to help them learn about what their depression is and isn't, and even identify people living and struggling with depression in the first place. It's having that clinical supervision piece so you can really expand or augment treatment and care as needed. And it's connecting as best to other supports and services while you're offering treatment in an accessible location, like someone's home or by the phone or at a community center. So that's the model, but problem solving is often what people focus on as like the important bit. I think lastly, when you're talking, you want to throughout the training be talking about clinical supervision. So even though today we're going to focus on how you teach problem solving, I just recommend throughout the training you remind people about that floor. So clinical case review, clinical supervision, psychiatric consultation. It is just essential that you have this in place. Once you start doing problem solving, once you start doing a PHQ-9 and behavioral activation, inevitably there'll be some co-occurring medical concerns that will come up. There'll maybe be some more complex psychiatric or other mental health needs that'll be identified that weren't identified initially. Maybe there'll be some things happening with people taking medications that are interacting negatively. Maybe they're on some high-risk medications. So this is really key that you highlight the importance of clinical supervision, even as we're now going to focus on teaching you skills about problem solving and behavioral activation. So it might seem like it ping pongs throughout the training, but that's just because we really want to make sure people understand the importance of it. Any questions before we talk about the 7 steps and how to teach that?
I will say that it seems like more frequently than not, whatever the problem that is chosen by the client for that weekly session or whatever session we're on, it often has a physical or a social component to it.
Yep.
So we end up kind of being redundant in that. And I hope that that's okay, because I always just roll with that.
Oh yeah, no, when I was doing Pearls clinically, I think sleep issues and pain issues were the most common things I managed with folks. And that was not my choice. That was their choice. Yeah. So, and I think, Dina, it's, especially now when we get into teaching them the steps, I think it's totally okay to give those examples, because I think people tend to get really worried when you start asking people what their problems are. And, inevitably, some people will identify some really tough relationship issues, that they want to work on. And problem solving doesn't lend itself as well to those. Doesn't mean you can't do problem solving around relationship issues, but it actually works, I think, a lot better for something like managing a medical condition or somatic symptoms of depression, because there's usually a lot more tangible solutions somebody can do. The relationship stuff can happen too, but often it's just so out of your control that you try stuff, and that's okay. Yeah. And I honestly think a lot of what the difference with problem solving treatment and, having your primary care provider, for instance, give you guidance on managing medical conditions is that it's pretty one-sided when you're talking with your PCP. It's usually only 15 minutes. And there isn't just an opportunity to be like, can I even do this in my life, around exercise or diet or sleep changes or things like that. So I think just problem solving provides more time, and then more of a kind of patient-centeredness, and then being intentional about goals, being intentional about what you're going to do if things don't work the way you want them to. And so, yeah, it can really complement, I think, what the primary care provider is doing. Yeah, good point. There's no one right problem to. Welcome, Allison. I see you're here.
Hi, I was about to jump in. I didn't know if I was too late at this point.
No. There's never too late.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So basically, we've talked about kind of how you describe the whole Pearls process, like from recruitment to follow-up call and closeout. And then we've talked about what the rationale is for teaching older adults or your clients with depression, the problem-solving treatment and the behavioral activation. So we're recording this so you can catch up another time with those. And now we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about how you teach problem-solving and behavioral activation to your trainees. So let me just move this. Okay. So this is where I think in the training, whether you're doing virtually or doing in person, I often encourage folks to take out the worksheet just so they can follow along and jot down notes. They don't have to. If you find people just looking at things and it's a little bit of a dance as a trainer, you want them to know their resources are there, but you don't want them to be reading while they're talking to you. But the worksheet is just steps. They can just take notes on it. So just a heads up, that's something that's helpful to do. All right, so the next part of the training is really, let's get in the meat of it. So we're going to talk about what those 7 steps of problem solving are that you're going to be teaching your clients. These are the 7 steps. First, starting with clarifying and defining the problem. Next, supporting your client in setting a realistic goal. Step 3 is generating multiple solutions or brainstorming to try and achieve that goal. Step 4 is really evaluating and comparing those solutions or weighing the pros and cons. Step 5 is selecting a feasible solution. Step 6 is coming up with an action plan on how you're going to do or implement that solution. And then step 7 happens at your next Pearl session. So it's connecting with the client about how to go and evaluating it and then making changes accordingly going forward. So next, we're going to talk about how to do each of these steps and also some of the why we have each of these steps in place to serve as problem-solving treatment. So this is, I think, the most important step and sometimes the hardest step. It's the one that you're going to want to practice the most. And I assure you, it will get easier to do this. Step 1 is clarifying and defining the problem. And what this means is getting really specific about what the problem is for somebody and really helping reducing some of that vagueness or broadness about a problem. So often when we have problems, we talk about them as feelings that are pretty broad. So for example, feeling really lonely and I can't remember the last time I've not felt this lonely. So that's a legitimate way to feel, especially during this pandemic. I think many of us can relate to that feeling. But by stating it as a feeling that's very broad, it makes it feel pretty insurmountable when you're struggling with depression. So to clarify and define that problem, you would ask the client, well, when are you feeling lonely? And when was where is it that you're feeling lonely? Are you feeling lonely in your house? Or when were you last feeling lonely? Can you tell me a little bit about that? What does loneliness look like for you? How would I know that you're feeling lonely today? And that'll get them talking and help them identify what specifically is a problem for them about being lonely, right? Because some of us, like I personally like to spend a lot of time alone. Doesn't mean I'm lonely. But in this person's case, they would define it as, well, I just don't really see my friends often enough. And so I'm really not feeling connected. And, I just don't feel like I have someone to talk to when I'm really struggling with some of my health issues or, my daughter and I are at each other and I just don't have friends to be able to get that support from. That makes it much more specific and much more sort of a function or a behavior in terms of why it is that it's a problem for their life. This client isn't getting emotional support. This client doesn't have someone to reach out to when they need somebody to vent about this challenging issue with their daughter or when their arthritis is acting up and they're in a lot of pain. So by doing this step this way and being really specific about clarifying and defining the problem, it allows us to both be specific about why it is a problem for someone, but also it helps to break down something complex and broad, like I'm feeling lonely, into something smaller. So it's a very specific action or lack of something. I don't see my friends often enough. I think the last important thing to teach people about this step is that it really has to be a problem that is something they can do something about and not somebody else. So if you define the problem as somebody else's problem, for example, all my kids, they don't call me often enough, it's going to be very hard for you to come up with something that you can do or your client can do about it. So really helping the client to restate the problem with an I is really helpful. So in this case, I don't talk to my kids as often as I'd like. because then that'll set them up for the whole rest of the worksheet where we're coming up with what's a reasonable way to try to tackle this problem in the next week or month or however much time you have together between sessions. So step 2 can sometimes be pretty straightforward. It's just an opposite of the problem. So if we go back to that last one, I'd like to see my friends more often. That could be a goal for the week, right? It's often stated in the positive, as most goals are, but it needs to be realistic and achievable. So really, especially in your early sessions, you want to make sure that the goal is set, even if it seems kind of small to the client, that they are successful in trying to achieve it. They might not get there totally, but the more successful somebody can be initially, the more likely they are to stick with the program and to learn these skills. You also want to balance, though, their autonomy or agency with like questioning, gentle nudging questioning to ensure they can do it. So for example, if a client says, my problem is that I'm not exercising, I'm not being physically active, I'm really worried about my heart, my kids are on me, my doctor's on me. So my goal for this week is I'm going to do an hour of aerobics 7 days a week. That's a pretty 0 to 60 kind of goal. I don't think actually anyone I know would be able to do that, whether or not they were older, struggling with depression, and had complex like health and social needs. So you can ask gentle questioning to help the client see that without telling them what to do. Because a lot of what problem solving treatment is you're teaching the client a way to address their problems, not solving their problems for them, which is honestly how most of us approach social and other services. So you might say something like, wow, that's amazing that you want to do an hour of aerobics 7 days a week. I'm wondering how much activity were you doing when you were last active? And that will get them starting to think about what's realistic for them. They may say something like, gosh, I've actually never done that in my life. I don't want to, or my body hurts too much. And they will start to figure out that maybe they need to narrow that goal and set it a little bit differently. We'll talk about SMART goals, I think, at the webinar next week or the week following. That can also help people kind of come up with better goals. But these are the main points you want to teach about goal setting or setting a realistic goal. The other thing I will say is think about how much time you have between this session and your next one. So at the weekly sessions, you're setting a goal for next week. But at your monthly sessions, you're setting a goal for the whole month. So that goal is going to kind of widen in terms of what someone can achieve in that amount of time. So step 3 of problem solving is now that we've identified our problem, made it specific so it feels like we can kind of wrap our head around it, and set a realistic goal for next week, we now are going to generate some multiple solutions. And it's really important during this step that you brainstorm and think outside of the box. So often what we do is we sort of edit and judge as we go. We come up with one solution. Maybe it's something that our friend told us we should do. Maybe it's something we've always done. And then we stop. And the problem with that is we sometimes don't pick the best solution to achieve that goal. Or we pick something that is something that's actually really hard for us to do. So even though we know it's what we should be doing, it's actually not something that's realistic for us. So brainstorming gets us out of that. The pandemic has honestly helped with this. Like it gets us just to think out of the box because we kind of have to. We cannot do the world or do the things we used to do. So you can sometimes be funny here. You can use humor. Go really out there. Sometimes this is where, for example, like if somebody is struggling with, let's say if someone's struggling with money stuff, you could talk about like, well, why don't you just rob a bank or something? I mean, like in a joking way. If somebody is not in a good place to joke, do not use humor. But it's like coming up with a crazy idea just to get them to think, oh, well, I definitely would not rob a bank because of X, Y, and Z. And so it just gets them to think that not every solution is appropriate to achieve their goal. You have to, though, judge the person or not judge. You have to kind of work with the person where they are. Some people love humor. And some people get really offended by it. So use humor appropriately with the clients that you're working with. And some of this happens over time. You'll use humor more as you get to know each other. So now that we've generated some solutions, and I really encourage your clients to come up with those solutions, you as a coach or counselor will be asked sometimes what solutions they should do. But I really encourage you to sit on your hands and see what they can come up with. And then if they're stuck, you're welcome to offer some suggestions. Where you will see them maybe not find the best solution is here in step 4. Because this is where you're not just listing out solutions, but you're actually working with them to help them say, okay, so now that we've come up with 4 possible solutions for your problem to achieve this goal this week, I want you now to think about what are the pros and cons of those solutions, or what are the pluses and minuses, or the advantages and disadvantages. Use whatever words you think are going to resonate with the client. And you want to teach them that the reason we do that is because often we pick the first thing that comes to mind without actually weighing what are some of the advantages and disadvantages. And that sets us up for failure in a few ways. It might be that we pick something that actually just isn't possible. We don't have the time, the resources, the energy to do it. And so by continuing to pick it, it actually makes us feel worse. Sometimes, though, we see that there's actually tons of advantages to something, but one major disadvantage. And so even though initially we think, oh yeah, I'm going to do that solution to go see my friends more often, the big disadvantage is that, I'm not vaccinated yet because I can't because of this chronic health issue I have. And so even though there's all these advantages to going out and seeing them at the senior center, that's the big deal breaker for me. I'm not yet comfortable to put myself at risk for COVID. So this can really help you come up with a better solution that's going to work for addressing your problem that you can actually do. It's not just about solving the problem, it's about actually achieving, your goal too. Yeah, Cynthia?
I get a lot of people that want to do all the things, all of those.
Oh yeah.
That we came up with.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to do all 4 of these.
Yeah, good question. And so step 5, selecting one, right? So a couple things. So with step 5, you really, it is okay to pick more than one. So it doesn't have to be that just because I'm asking you to come up with a plan that one of these, only one has to happen. And I will say in some cases, 2 of the solutions actually fit really well together. So if we're thinking about the problem around, I don't talk to my kids often enough, it could be that one of the possible solutions was that I'm going to try to, schedule a regular time that we talk on Sundays after church. And then one of the other solutions might be that I'm going to ask my friends about how they've gotten, like one of my friends is really reconnected with her daughters. And I don't know how she did it. So I'm going to ask her for her advice. Like those 2 actually can work kind of well together. So there's no reason to not do both. But if somebody does want to pick 4 of them, I would just encourage you to ask them, to ask them why it is they need to do all 4 and whether they'd be willing to start with 1 or 2, just as a way to not overwhelm themselves. And that, part of what makes us better problem solvers is being more realistic about what we can and can't do in the week ahead. Particularly when we're depressed, we sometimes can bite off more than we can chew just because we have some good days and bad days. And so you could kind of use that strategy. The other thing I tell people is, people are autonomous, right? They're their own beings. And part of the way they learn is by things not working out. So if someone is dead set on doing all 4 of those solutions and putting them into their action plan, try it and then talk about it next week. And next week is usually when you'll identify maybe that was too much, or maybe they actually all did work together and this person was really able to, make them work. So it's kind of having that support experimentation, support trying what works for you, as long as they're not going to put, there's any safety concerns or anything like that, then I think it's also okay just to let them try. Did you have another comment, Cynthia?
Yeah.
Yep.
So how do I phrase this? So I'm pretty well known in the community as being somebody who, do you know what a yellow book is? Senior yellow book?
You were talking about that last time, right? The resources directory?
Yeah, it's a
Yep.
senior yellow book.
Yeah.
Where, I don't know, can you see that?
Yeah, no, I'm remembering you showed, on our last call. Yeah.
So, I guess one of the community jokes about me is that I'm a walking, talking yellow book.
Okay.
Okay. I know, right? And so often when I meet with folks, they want to put me as one of the solutions,
Uh-huh. Yep.
talk to Cynthia and get the phone number or email or whatever about whatever it is they're looking like. I met with someone yesterday,
Yep.
they're housebound, so we talked about helping hands. So they want to get it from me, and I feel like I'm doing it for them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm curious, others on the call, how would you handle something like that? Where someone keeps picking you as the solution.
I guess I'm the only one with that problem. Oh, geez.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard it come up, Cynthia, in terms of people always like deferring to their care manager or case manager to do it for them. And so I think that there's a couple ways I think you can handle it. One is you can make sure that they're picking it in a way that there's something that they do. So it can't just be, option B is that Cynthia solves my problem, right? But more, option B is I'm going to talk to Cynthia about what are ways that I can safely get involved with the senior center without using Zoom. Like, do they have any phone options that I can do? And the advantages is that Cynthia's sitting right here. I can ask her about it, and the disadvantage is like, well, I've asked Cynthia for help before and she's given me resources, but I've never done anything about it. Right. And that is a useful insight to have. So even though they've picked you before, they've gotten ideas from you, they have an insight now about, well, wait, I keep on trying that solution and it keeps on not helping me solve my problem. So I think use the skills to your advantage. It's not about problem solving treatment is not about helping people solve all their problems. It's about teaching them skills to help them address their problems now and going forward. And so sometimes that's going to take time, and it's going to be a couple of sessions of relying on you to do it for them and realizing that that's not a great fit for them. So that'd be one idea, but definitely something to work on, and to make sure that you are reflecting back to them the value of them picking solutions that they can drive rather than having to rely on somebody else. Yeah. So yeah, it's yeah. And then the other thing I'll say is if they really are like in crisis and they need acute case management, it's okay to like time out, and do problem solving for things that they're not in crisis about, but then support them as a case manager in other ways. Like, that's a lot of agencies do stuff like that, even if it's the same person providing both services. They just kind of wait till the end or at the start of the visit, just kind of address acute needs. And then they teach the skills for things that are not as much of a like, this has to be solved this week, otherwise this person's not going to have a house or something like that. Right. So I'll remind you about that too. Great. Good question. So I think the other things to highlight here in terms of picking the solution is you really want to ask the client, what do they feel has the best chance of achieving their goal? And which one do they think is the most doable or feasible? This is not your chance to pick the one that you think is the best solution for achieving their goal and which one you think is the most feasible. Particularly at the beginning, you got to give them a chance to try. They're going to learn a ton from picking something that they've kind of always done, they're used to doing, or trying something that's a little bit beyond their skill set. They're actually going to learn a lot from that, as long as, again, it's not a safety issue. And honestly, what'll happen is in step 6, where you start to implement the solution and come up with steps, that can sometimes be when they realize that maybe they didn't pick the right one. So it's okay to kind of pick another one as you're starting to do this action planning in step 6. So the key thing you want to ask a client when you're doing step 6 is, what do you need to make this happen? How are you going to do this? Who are you going to do it with? What do you need to do it? Where are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? So really asking those questions to the client. Some people will have lots of ideas here, and if anything, you just need to kind of rein them in. Other people, they haven't even thought about that. They haven't even thought about the fact that, oh gosh, if I am going to start trying to walk to my mailbox every day to try to get out of my house, like, I'm going to need to figure out where my umbrella is because the weather's been lousy, or I got to really find that cane because I've been pretty nervous about falling. And even though I don't want to use it, like, I'm not willing to leave the house without it. So all those steps are important because they're the things that are going to help us be successful in carrying out our solution. So I have on the slide the paint the bedroom example, but use whatever example is appropriate for you. Help break down to people the fact that it's often not just one step to carry out a solution. And the other reason it's important to have the steps fleshed out is that after I'm not here with you, it's going to get harder to do this. You know, you might not remember, you might not have someone to motivate you. And so just by putting those steps there, it's going to set you up for success when you get out of bed tomorrow and you're feeling like kind of low energy and not motivated. If you have that worksheet next to you and you put what that first step is, it's much more likely that you're going to be successful. So after we do the step 6 and come up with the steps to implement the solution, which is often known as action planning, it's really important to spend a little time with your client on the confidence scale. So for those of you who've done some motivational interviewing, this is from that work. And really the goal here is to have the client take a moment and assess their confidence in the action plan. And so you're just going to ask them, so tell me, you know, Cynthia, after we've gone through the steps of what you're going to do for the next 2 weeks, how confident do you feel that you're going to be able to be successful in carrying out those steps? And based on what number she says, you want to ask a few follow-up questions. So let's say Cynthia says, I feel somewhat confident. I think I'm a 7. You want to ask Cynthia what a 7 means to her. And the reason you do is because that will help the person gain some insight about where they fall on the scale and what somewhat confident means for them. Some people are like chronically pessimistic or chronically optimistic. And so a 7 truly does mean different things. I think of a 7 as pretty awesome, but some people might be like, not a 10. So therefore, 7 means I'm really nervous about this. So ask that question. Next, you want to really emphasize that they do have some abilities and they are ready to make a change by asking them why they're not a lower number. So in this example, if Cynthia was a 7, ask, why do you think you weren't a 4 or 5 on the somewhat confident scale? And that's a chance for the client to share what it is they do think they can do. Oh, well, I've really wanted to do this for a long time, and writing down the steps actually makes me feel like I'm going to be more successful at doing it. And then they leave the session kind of with that positive kind of, hey, wait, I actually have the skills or the tools or the confidence in doing this. And then the last question you want to ask, unless they're a 10, is, what would help you move higher? So not from a 7 to a 10, but what would help you get a little higher, 1 or 2 points higher on the confidence scale? Is there anything else we want to change or write down on this action plan? And the reason we do that is this is your chance to make adjustments, anticipate barriers, weather, time, money, food, you name it. Anticipate things that are going to come up, adjust the plan accordingly, and then move on and start to do the behavioral activation. So the last step happens at your next session. This is a little confusing because you think, 7 steps of problem solving, but I don't do them all at once. And the reason is because you have to see what happens. This is really a chance for you and the client to improve your problem solving skills. So right when you start your next session, after you see how the client's doing, do a PHQ-9, you ask them how'd it go? How'd your plan go last week? Start with what went well. It's always good to start with what went well and their strengths because that sets the stage for the rest of the session. Even if nothing went well, there's often something you can grab onto. Maybe it's that they have their worksheet ready to go and they're on time to the appointment with you. They had put their worksheet in a spot where they could see it. Anything, any small behavior change is a success that you want to celebrate with the client. And then you want to figure out what got in the way. So what didn't get so well, what got in the way, and very quickly, instead of just venting, you want to move to, well, how are you going to think about doing things differently next time? That's the really key thing about step 7. It's not meant to be a judgment. It's not meant to be like a grade. Oh, I did it or I didn't. It's really meant to help you be a better problem solver. We always can learn something from our problem solving. And let's take what we learned from today to apply it, to today's worksheet. So questions about the steps and how you teach them, I encourage you to think of other examples to use. You don't just have to use the examples I've used here. Use what you know, use what you see in your clients, and use what has been successful. Questions about how to teach that?
Not necessarily a question, but I have found because we do the advantages and disadvantages when we're evaluating each solution, I often reflect back to that when we get to the implementation part because it helps pinpoint areas in that who, what, when, where, why, where they already have identified part of that that's working for them, and also the challenge is part of it, where they need to kind of focus a little bit on how to make sure that the implementation plan addresses that challenge that was identified.
Yeah, nice. That's a really nice way to connect the steps, Dina, because sometimes people may not address those disadvantages in their action plan. And so this evaluation allows them to connect that. And that's where you can highlight that. If they're not connecting those dots, that's, I think, where you as a coach or counselor come into play. You can kind of help them see, like, I wonder if, that I know you said that one of the disadvantages and let's see, and reaching out to your neighbor about that is that your neighbor sometimes is kind of like judgy, and she sometimes makes you feel like less than. And so I noticed we didn't really address that in our action plan. So what do you think about that? What might you do differently next time? And they might think like, the neighbor's off the table. Or they might just like give themselves a pep talk before or after they have that conversation. Like, I know that she's going to be kind of judgy, but I kind of need her help with something. So I'm going to make sure after I talk to her, I do something to make me feel good. I'm going to take a bath, something like that. Yeah, good idea. Other things? All right, so we just have a few more things I think we want to cover for today. We will talk about doing behavioral activation next time, but this is really where I want to talk about in the training, sort of once you've taught those steps, it's now the time in the training where people get to get their feet wet, which is super fun. So this is where you want to give your trainees a few more tools to help them practice together. And if you're on Zoom, you're using breakout rooms. If you're in a room, you're separating people. Kind of depends on how many people you're training when you get to this point in the training. But we quickly move from teaching how to do it to trying it while it's fresh. So you've shown them the worksheet at this point, you're highlighted where it is. This is where you pull it out again, and you really want to emphasize the value of using it. It can really help you do the steps of problem solving, plan activities, and plan pleasant events. If you haven't already, this is where you let people know that really this is something that you do together. We would love it if the person fills it out themselves. It's only going to help them be better at doing it on their own when you're not there. But it's also okay for you to do it initially and make a copy for them to keep. Some people are not comfortable writing. This is not something they normally do. They're a little nervous about it. So this should not be a deal breaker if someone's not ready to do that. There's the worksheet. We have the Google Drive. You can highlight it however you want. Clearly, if you're doing something in person, you're welcome to print all this stuff out. The other thing I like to highlight at this point in the training, even though we're not going to get to it until supervision, is this tracking chart. This is, not a required tool, but can be a helpful tool. This is where you have a snapshot of all of your participants on one page. I will admit there is not a lot of room for under each session to write what the problem is that they were addressed and their plan for physical and social and pleasant events. So if you need to expand this to more than one page, but this is just meant to be a tool to support you as a client and as a way to also use during supervision. So I kind of like to give people a heads up about this. Sometimes you're training people who keep very little documentation, that they've never had to do documentation. And other times they've had to keep like really detailed medical documentation. And so this is just a way to kind of give them a heads up for what we think is useful for your program, but you might need to adjust as needed based on your agency. So next, role plays. So we really recommend the first role play or pairs. I know that there's some people who do it in groups or larger groups, but you really want to try to get everybody practicing now that you've gone over the skills. We encourage you doing a middle session, so don't worry about introducing yourself, setting the stage, all that stuff. This is just like, imagine you're at session 3 and you're going through the problem solving. It's really important while they're practicing doing the skills and the steps that they try to practice why each step is there. There's actually in the toolkit, I'll pull it up when I get off the slideshow. There's actually a section of the toolkit that has each of the steps for problem solving, and then it has like a sample script of what you might say to somebody. It can feel like it's a lot to tell someone the rationale for something while you're doing the steps, but that's going to help the person really understand why it is they have to do each piece. and it'll help them learn it better, quite frankly. When you're doing it on Zoom, you can kind of pop in and out of breakout rooms. If you're in a room, you can ask people to ask questions as they arise, but I encourage people just to try it. I try to be very like, get your feet wet, pick a role play, pick a real play. Try to give them at least 20 minutes each. Sometimes you have to adjust, but enough time to get into it. It's okay if they don't finish it. But it's really a chance for them to put the skills in action and then you to come back together and debrief. And these are the questions we typically recommend. If you're limited in time, I would definitely just highlight the where they have questions. But the nice thing about asking either the what worked well or what did you notice is it allows people to describe the potential benefits of this model in their own words and encourage people to talk about both their experience as the counselor as well as the client, because I think it can also help with some of the kind of healthy skepticism about how this is going to work with the people I see. And if you had an experience as the client that actually was like, oh, this surprisingly worked, like I felt really comfortable even though it was so structured, it's good to say that stuff out loud just to help kind of get your trainees to buy in. Questions about the role play and how you're going to do that, thinking about your trainees? I will say be attuned to power dynamics here. So if you have the luxury of training a group that is bigger, like try not to put someone with their boss unless they have to be. I tend to do it pretty randomly, but we do when we're doing virtual trainings. We've had 40 people. And so we do try to make sure that people aren't necessarily with their colleagues initially if you're training multiple agencies. Or it's like two students who are together. I mean, some people really like having a person who's their supervisor who maybe has more clinical wisdom, but it's like, this is the chance for them to try it out and not feel super nervous about stuff like that. So if you have that ability, I recommend it. And if you have an odd number, they can practice with you or they can do a threesome. I like having them practice with one of the trainers first. So you make sure somebody tries, but as long as they get a chance to get their feet wet, a threesome's fine too. Okay, awesome. So I think that's the main stuff we wanted to cover today. What is coming up though, as you think about how to teach? There's a lot we covered. We covered the process, we covered the rationale for problem solving and behavior activation, and then we took a deeper dive into how you do the steps. Any questions, concerns about how you might teach that before we practice together? Okay. So let's do a frequently asked question before we do the teach back. So often when you're teaching the problem solving steps, somebody will ask something like, what if somebody picks a solution that I'm concerned is hazardous for them? Like it's a dangerous solution. I'm concerned about their safety or other safeties. What should I do? Because you just told me I'm supposed to let them drive. That's how they learn. But now I'm really concerned about their well-being. How might one of you answer that during a training? Again, there's no real right or wrong answer here.
I might go back to that list of pros and cons that we collaborated on together during kind of that evaluation process of all of the solutions, just to as like a recap, so that I'm maybe putting that back in the forefront of their mind, but I'm not directly saying like, I think this is dangerous and that you shouldn't do it. So maybe bringing it back to the work that we'd already done together.
Yeah, nice. That's a great way to do it, because they might have identified a disadvantage around safety or danger, but they might have not. And so you could gently kind of hold up that mirror in the context of weighing the pros and cons. Nice. Other ideas?
Yeah, kind of going off that same concept that I talked about earlier, if it was or was not identified in the pros and cons, as Andrea mentioned, highlighting that, but then also highlighting that risk or whatnot in the implementation, kind of addressing a step in the implementation that calls that into question. If this dangerous thing happened, whatever it was, how would that be accounted for?
Yeah, right. That's another great place to do it. And maybe it's come up or maybe it hasn't. And it could even come up in some of the confidence things too, in terms of what they might be nervous about. Nice. Another thing that people often ask about is can people work on the same problem at every session? You know, some big, hairy, intractable problem. Is it okay to just work on the same problem for all 8 sessions together? What do you guys think?
I have had people that we've had to, because like you mentioned, I think maybe not every session for 8 sessions, but I think early on, kind of like you pointed out, sometimes because this is a new process, they do learn something about like, oh, I chose that solution that maybe wasn't the best solution. So sometimes we have reworked the same problem once or twice just because, but I always felt like that at least demonstrated some learning on their part. And so it felt like we weren't just doing the same thing over and over again. We were actually trying to do it differently to actually solve the problem.
I think too that as kind of like what Dina's saying, that as you go along and maybe they're retrying solutions, maybe something that they thought was a really big problem when they started this brand new process, as they've gotten some skill and mastery and success at working on the problem, it actually might become smaller and it may not be as big of a deal anymore. Kind of like doing desensitization to something that seems really, really scary. If you have some success in a small step on that scale of like 1 to 10 of fear, it becomes, the problem overall becomes less scary to you. So maybe they think they're going to work on this for all 8 sessions, but come, week 5, they're like, okay, I think I figured this out. I want to switch. So I encourage the folks I work with to let the participant really be, like you said, the driver of this. And if this problem really is that big that it's going to take 8 weeks to get them to a point where they think they've mastered what to do with it and various components of it, great. As long as they're learning the skill and then can generalize that to other things, that I think is really what our purpose is.
Yeah, I think you both touched on the important piece, which is, are you learning new things and doing new things as part of that big, hairy problem? And if yes, then it is okay. It's okay to break it into different pieces and tackle different components, or as Dina, you were saying, sort of apply a learning to something next time. I think the main thing to watch out for is if it's just someone's just sort of going through the motions, or if it's something that they've actually gotten a pretty good handle on. And so even though they want to keep working on it with you, they probably are actually able to maybe try it on their own. And then you might gently remind them of the value of applying these steps to different types of problems in their lives, and that we can still talk about this problem and check in about it, but I'm wondering if you want to try, I have this problem list when we first started working together. What do you want to try looking at this together and picking something else? And that's just a way to kind of hone the skills differently. Like if you keep on making the same thing in the kitchen, you're not necessarily you're gonna be really good at making spaghetti and meatballs, but you're not gonna necessarily be good at baking bread, right? And so there's some value sometimes in trying to bake bread and just kind of learning a new skill and applying what you've learned already to that. So I think that's the other thing, but definitely, especially in the early sessions, you want them to drive, you want them to pick things that matter to them and really feel like they're getting something out of this treatment, and get to know you and feel like this process is helping them. Yeah, so great. And if you don't get that question, I'll be super surprised because it comes up all the time. Okay, so let's spend the rest of our time together practicing teaching. So I would love it if one of you describe, early on today, we talked about why it is we do problem solving treatment and behavioral activation. So what's the rationale behind it or the theory behind it? And then somebody else, it'd be great if you teach us how to do steps 5 and 6, including the confidence scale. So selecting a solution, coming up with the steps to do that solution or the action plan, and then going through the confidence scale. So I'll take a moment, see who wants to volunteer, and then I'm happy to pull up slides if that's helpful.
I can do the second one, the step 5 and 6 in the confidence scale.
Great.
I think
Thanks, Dina.
I'm due.
Oh, boy. Do I need to volunteer?
Should I volunteer you?
Needs to volunteer, Cynthia. They want to volunteer.
Cynthia, do you want me to volunteer you like you volunteered me last week?
Yeah, go ahead, volunteer me.
I love it.
I'm just kidding, Cynthia.
I love it.
Just kidding.
Oh, God. All right, I'm gonna try.
Awesome. This is the group to try it with. You're modeling exactly what you're teaching your trainees who are teaching it to their clients. Cynthia, do you want me to keep the slides up or do you want to pull things up on your own?
Why don't you put them up? You're much
Okay.
more savvy.
Okay. Sometimes, I don't know, the other day I was a mess with my breakout rooms, but you know, it's the Zoom gremlins.
Who would have known?
I try to, fake it till I make it. When I'm on Zoom, I'm just like, you know what? We're all in this together. Okay, wait, I passed it. Okay. So this is the stuff. So kind of why we do the behavioral activation and then why we do problem solving treatment. So I'll let you take a moment, Cynthia, and then just let me know when you're ready.
Can we do it next week? All right. I'm never ready. So go with the flow, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
We call it's BA, behavioral activation. And what we try to do is encourage different activities. 3 of those are social, physical, and behavioral, I think. Anyway, so the big thing that we have to remember is that depression is involved when we do less, we feel worse, we do less, we feel worse, till we get to a point where we're doing probably nothing, if at all, anything. So we've tried to focus on the BA, behavioral activation, trying to encourage them, even if they don't feel like it, to do things that they used to like to do, so that they can move out of feeling worse and enjoy those things again. It's not actually working from the inside of our soul. We have to work from the outside. So an example I often give to people is about myself. I am a non-athletic person. I do not like being physically active. And I had to push myself to do more exercise. And what I found is that the more exercise I did, the more I felt good. I was achieving something. I was getting things done for me. It was me time. And so if I had waited for me to feel like doing it, it probably would have never happened. But to give myself, I've got to start, let's do this 10 minutes today, next week, 15 minutes, and slowly increase it. What do you think? So it's basically the same thing with our social, and I did it backwards, didn't I? But with social.
There's no right or wrong with the order, Cynthia. You got this.
All right. So, with our social, waiting for others to call me may not be the thing to do. So socially, I call my friends. I talk to them. And that encourages them at some point to maybe call me. Waiting for them to get my ESP thought to call me isn't going to work. So if we plan these things and make phone calls or plan pleasant activities, what do I like to do? And then push myself to do it. What do I want to do? This kind of pleasant activity scheduling is not necessarily something that makes us happy, but it's something that we have in the past found pleasant, enjoyable. For me, one of the big things is watering my plants. It doesn't necessarily make me happy to spend that hour watering all of them, but I enjoy the plants. So it does enhance how I live my life and makes me feel better, but we don't want to plan anything that is controlled by others. If we do that, then we don't have the ability to make it happen. You know, if I want my kids to call me more, that's up to them to decide whether or not they're going to do it. So I have to make the moves to make them happen, or make them, I'm sorry, make it happen.
Mhm.
Um, so, oh, PST, am I supposed to do that too?
Yeah,
Oh,
take a moment, take a minute to tell us why it is that we teach our clients problem solving treatment. Just very brief rationale.
be brief. Leslie, you know me better than that. Okay,
Hey, you're never going to get through the training.
I know.
I have learned the hard way. I'm very talkative.
Oh, it's terrible. Okay, so very quickly, there are 7 steps to the PST, problem-solving treatment. They are wonderful, helpful tools that we can teach our clients. And that's what we need to do. We need to teach them how to use these. So what I do is I have one of those worksheets that I use, and I have a worksheet that I offer them. So they can write down these things as we go along. And so we start with figuring out what problem. We take a problem from our problem list, which I also give them a copy of at the very beginning that they can add to anytime they want, so that we can discuss it in a future meeting. But pick one that we can work on together today. And then when we take that problem is we want to make it specific. If it's specific to doing something and a positive goal, then it's more easily done than being a problem. So in other words, the problem is my kids don't call me, right? So the goal is not the kids don't call me. The goal would be, I want to talk to my children more, for example. And then we set this into realistic goals. Can I do this? Can I make this happen by the time we visit again? So if the goal is to go on a trip to Alaska, that's not going to happen in a week. Or at least I don't think so. But so, make it realistic and use I statements in the goal. I will do this. I will make this happen, so that it's something you do, you have power over. And then step 3, did I even go over any of that?
Yeah, I'm gonna. You can pause because I know that Dina's gonna teach us some of the later steps. So thank you, Cynthia, for volunteering. I really like how when you're training and teaching, you use examples from your work. I think that helps make it real for people. And I think you hit on all the high points that you need to for behavioral activation. You know, it's really important to connect people to that cycle of doing less and feeling bad and worse. Um, that, the example of if you waited till you felt better, you probably would have never exercised. That's I think it's a thing that everybody could relate to around exercise. And then with the pleasant events, that it's really not happiness, it's things that are enjoyable to you. And that maybe have not brought you joy, but that can bring you joy again. I would say the one thing to add with the rationale for behavioral activation is that it's specifically, you said it's focused on social and physical and pleasant events, but just adding that kind of why piece, that it's because we know that all those things have been shown to help people alleviate their depressive symptoms. That is, again, some people don't really care about the why, but I find knowing about the why, that there's either evidence that it's an antidepressant or a mood booster or the theory behind it, that sometimes helps people kind of grab onto it during the training. And then with the problem solving treatment, you did great starting to tell me about all the different steps. So I would say I liked some of the phrasing you used, and I like the I statement too piece. I don't think I highlighted that in any of my overview today. So thank you for doing that as a way to illustrate that people can have to be in control of it. before you get into the steps, though, this is the piece you want to teach. You want to make sure that people understand really the rationale for problem solving treatment, that these symptoms are caused by everyday problems. If those problems resolve somewhat, we think that they'll improve and that we can actually help resolve them using these techniques. And then you can get into the details of the steps with someone. So this is just kind of a setting the stage, why we do it, and then here's how we do it. And that's what you get to do next. Yeah. So nice work, nice examples. Other feedback or comments or questions for teaching this part of the training from the group?
I loved your personal examples also, Cynthia. I thought that was really a good way to make it less like theory-based and more practical, which sometimes is really helpful in trainings, to hear somebody who's used it say, here's how this works for me. And then not at all related to anything other than a comment about rationales separate from your work right now, Cynthia. I find in any CBT-based anything I do, that if my participant is not doing their home practice, it's because I haven't given them a good enough reason why this is going to work for them. And so that's a cue to me to go back and re-explain the rationale about why this is important, how this is going to help them, what's that take home for them. And so I always make sure to tell that to my folks I'm training in various CBT things too, that if they're not doing their homework, that's a cue to you to go back and explain why it's helpful for them again.
Yeah, Andrea, I really like that, because I think we tend to get caught up in the steps sometimes and making sure we do all the steps without taking a step back and saying, well, why are we even doing it this way? And so I like that framing of not like they're not compliant or not adhering, but like, no, I got to do a better job like selling and motivating and making sure they understand why it's important to try, and just encouraging them to try.
Exactly. And it takes away a lot of that frustration when our clients are quote unquote not compliant, right? Like, oh, they're being difficult. No, it's probably because I didn't do a good job at something. And so let me go back. And that's really helped me in my work a lot too.
Yeah, nice. Oh, I love that. Well, nicely done, Cynthia. Thanks for jumping in. It's a lot to cover, and definitely, these bullets are talking points. So I encourage you to, highlight them and then use those examples that you use so well. Dina, do you want me to pull up slides for your section, or do you have them in front of you?
I don't have them in front of me, but if you just maybe just put up like the Pearls worksheet, because I can just use that to kind of.
Totally. The worksheets at the end. Yeah. Sorry. Close your eyes. Don't barf. Okay. There you go.
Okay, so Cynthia did a great job of sort of introducing the problem-solving treatment and kind of the reason that we teach problem-solving treatment as part of the Pearls, and started to outline kind of the first few steps of the 7-step process that we're going to be doing with folks during each of our sessions, identifying a specific problem, helping the client that you're working with focus on, what goal that they want to achieve based on that problem, making sure that that is something that is that they have control over, something that's doable within the time frame that you're working on. And then once they've identified that goal and sort of started processing possible solutions, they're going to identify the advantages and disadvantages. And then once we get down to step 5, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. This is where we can really help people take this process that we've gone through about identifying this problem and really help them conceptualize what they can do to take control of this problem and find a way to solve it so that they can ultimately feel better. So once we've sort of guided the client, I'm in my therapy role today, through identifying one solution, then we're going to kind of help them formulate exactly how they're going to do it. And I often will reflect back on the advantages and disadvantages that they identified for that solution and kind of go through the steps in a very, very concrete way. Help them identify, what's the very first thing that we need to think about when we're implementing this solution, and that's going to be very specific based on what the identified solution is. Sometimes there's some sort of prep work that needs to happen. As Cynthia mentioned, sometimes people fall to her to kind of provide some of the resources. So sometimes the first few steps is helping them identify a specific resource that they need to achieve that solution, whether that's asking somebody for help or if they're going to do the research. So I try to be really as specific step-by-step as I can with that. We really want to focus on, what it is that they're going to do, who they may need to ask for help for the solution, where, if they require any kind of, going someplace to accommodate the solution, which happens a lot with older adults. There's a transportation component frequently that's involved in implementing a solution. So really working out the details of that. If there's a time frame that's specific to the solution, helping them identify, the best time of day that might be appropriate to implement the solution based on their physical needs or just, scheduling or whatnot. So really look at all the different dynamics of that solution that may come up when they're really trying to do this, and identify, as I mentioned before, those barriers and advantages, things that they already have going for them that are going to make it easier, and try to make that as specific as possible. I find that clients really appreciate and feel more confident if the more detailed that kind of steps to achieving the solution is. And so the next part, which is also really very important, is the confidence scale. It's not listed specifically as one of the steps, but it's really, I think, a very important part of the step. So, asking the patient or the client, where on the scale, and it's the way it's presented on the worksheet is really helpful, I think, because it kind of breaks it into shaded areas. Where on the scale do you feel you are in terms of being able to follow through with what we've discussed? And so then when they identify their number, kind of challenge them a little bit more on that number. If they're at a 7, say, well, okay, 7's pretty good. What do you feel about a 7? Does the 7 represent something that you feel really pretty good about? Get their input from them about what that means to them, because it can mean different things. A 7 can be really, really positive for some people, and for somebody else, it might feel like there's a little bit of second guessing they're doing about it. So if they identify a 7, then maybe ask them, okay, so why are you a 7 instead of a 5? What's working for you that's making you feel confident enough to say a 7? Sometimes you can use that as an opportunity to rework some of your steps to achieve the solution, if they identify something specific that needs to be reworked there. And also kind of the other complementary question to that is, how will we get you to an 8? What would be different to get you to an 8 versus a 7? So taking those scaling questions within the scale to help modify the steps to the solution, I think, is often really informative, because I think that once you get to this step with clients, they're really starting to envision themselves actually doing it. And so when they start to really envision themselves doing it, they start to kind of really work through, I think, almost more so than they do prior, the advantages and disadvantages. And so the confidence scale can be another way to kind of pinpoint specific parts in the solution that can be helpful to them. And then, are those?
That's it, Gina. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, nice. I really like your framing step 5 is where the rubber meets the road, because you're right. If you've done some work to get there, and it's an important place to actually then guide the rest of the work. And then right at the end there, where you commented on going through both step 6 and the confidence scale, really helps clients envision actually doing it, I think, is a nice framing around that, because it's true. By getting super specific, you went through all the who, what, whens, gave really examples of what that looks like, and then doing the confidence, it allows them to actually imagine what this is going to look like tomorrow, or whenever it is they said they're going to, carry out their plan. So really nice. Other feedback for Dina on step 5, 6 and the confidence scale?
I loved your confidence scale explanation and the way you walked through like the scaling questions within the scale. You did that so nicely. I was writing down some phrases. You did great.
Yeah.
And I will say that I have had folks change their solution once we get to that step. I don't know if anybody else has had that happen.
Oh yeah. You mean because they realize they're not confident?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. And that's okay. I mean, sometimes you're like, oh my God, we have 1 minute or whatever, but it does give you some reason to try to get there before you have time, so they can adjust and do that. I think the other thing that sometimes happens is they want to change something earlier, like, oh, I've got a totally different goal or something. And that's when you can kind of say, wow, this was really great work for today. Let's tackle that next time and apply what learnings we can with the activity planning, because sometimes that's just what happens. Your comment, Dina, also reminded me, some people do not resonate with the 1 to 10 scale. It's either just not culturally appropriate, or it's just not their worldview. They had some issues around numbers and grading, you name it. it's fine to use the words. And so your comment about the shading reminded me that people can just talk about not being confident or being very confident or somewhere in between, and how are they going to kind of move, and why is it that they're where they're at and not lower. So it's fine to kind of not use numbers if it doesn't resonate with folks. Yeah. Okay, awesome. So next time, what are we gonna do next time? Oh, we're gonna do a little bit more about doing Pearl sessions and behavior activation. And we're gonna do a little deeper dive into step 1 and 2, because inevitably those are the hardest and the most important. So we'll spend time on how it is that you support your trainees with that. There's just some brief stuff to look at. We'll also talk next time about introducing Pearls to a client. So like what happens during that first session. So take a look at that, and then we'll gather next week. I realize we're a minute over. I apologize. Anything else people want to bring to the table before we sign off for today? Okay, cool. You guys are doing great. It's awesome to learn from you, and keep up the good work. And I hope you have a beautiful, if you have a long weekend, have a beautiful long weekend. Otherwise, I'll see you on Thursday next week. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Whew. I'm not as well educated as everybody else, I don't think.